we'll get perspectives from two Israelis, but joining me now from Haifa is Diana Buttu. She is a former legal advisor to the PLO. She specializes in international human rights law. Diana, welcome to the show. What do you believe is behind the latest upsurge in violence?
What is definitely behind the current events is the fact that we have generation after generation of Palestinians who are living under Israeli military rule with no end in sight to this denial of freedom. In particular, the people who are currently engaged in protests in West Bank towns, this is a generation of people who were born under military occupation, lived under the false promises of Oslo and the negotiations promise. This is a generation that requires Israeli permits to do everything from go to the sea or to go to Jerusalem. This is a generation that has no hopes at all that they will ever see any freedom. And this is a generation that understands that it's perverse that one country occupy them, and therefore they're coming up forward and they're demanding their freedom. So all of these current events are the result of one thing: Israel's insistence on denying Palestinians their freedom.
Where do you see this heading? I mean, there are some commentators who are saying this could be the third Intifada, a major Palestinian uprising.
This is definitely something that is spreading. It's been across towns in the West Bank, in Gaza as well, and inside Palestinian communities that are inside Israel. People all across the board, Palestinians all across the board, and Palestinian supporters across the board are saying to Israel, enough is enough. If you look at just the timeline of it, this is 50 years, nearly 50 years, that Palestinians have not lived in freedom. And at the same time, what we continue to see is colonization. We continue to see Palestinian land being taken for Israeli settlers. We continue to see that Israeli settlers are given complete impunity to do whatever they want to Palestinians. And so this is not at all surprising to anybody who's been watching, that you see Palestinians finally taking to the streets and saying, enough, it's time for our freedom. I think the big issue now is whether the world community is just going to sit idly by, or whether they're going to jump in finally and say to Israel, enough is enough. It's time for you to end this military rule and allow Palestinians to finally live in the freedom and dignity that they deserve.
Right, I want to get to that in a moment, the international effort to find some kind of peace in this dispute. But a number of Jews have been attacked recently. Some have been killed in the recent violence. More Palestinians, of course, have been killed. But what about the Israeli argument that they must be able to provide security for their people?
Look, this is something that Israel has always been claiming, and what they don't really seem to understand is that they're only looking at one side of the equation. You can't step by and pretend that there is no cost to denying people your freedom. What Israel has done over the course of the past nearly 50 years is killed Palestinians, maimed Palestinians, destroyed generation after generation of Palestinians, and then on top of that they say in response, oh, but you can't touch us, you can't do anything to us. There's never been a people who've lived under the denial of freedom who haven't lashed out against the people who've oppressed them. And I think that if Israel is really interested in addressing the issue of security, they'll look at it from two sides of that coin: freedom and security for Palestinians as well. And so I think that the big issue that Israel seems to ignore is the fact that their denial of freedom is precisely what is causing this violence. And in order to address the violence, you have to address the denial of freedom. But I also want to touch upon one other point, which is that this isn't just a question of Palestinians killing Israelis. It's quite the opposite. The vast majority of people who've been killed are Palestinians. And in fact, what we've seen over the past 2 weeks is Israelis killing other Israelis because they believe that those Israelis are Palestinians themselves. We've seen a lot of these attacks in the country. And so all of this is begging one big issue, which is that if we want to see an end to violence, we have to start addressing the politics. We can't just put our heads in the sand and pretend that this is only an issue of violence.
You know, a few weeks ago at the United Nations, the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas said that the 20-year effort to establish a Palestinian state through the so-called Oslo Accords had failed. Do those accords now exist just in name?
They have only existed in name for quite some time. In particular, you know, from the year 1996 onward, Israel made it very clear that they had no intention, including this current Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was Prime Minister at the time, made it very clear that he had no intention of either abiding by the agreements, which called for a complete settlement freeze, or by even moving forward in terms of giving Palestinians their freedom, which is called for in the Oslo agreements at the end of a 5-year period. In other words, by 1999, Palestinians were supposed to be free. And here we are in the year 2015, and we're still waiting for that freedom. So the Oslo agreements have been just a piece of paper in name only for quite some time. The big charade of them and the big problem with them is that while they're only pieces of paper in name only, the restrictions that it placed on the Palestinian Authority, everything from demanding that Palestinians, the oppressed people, provide security to their oppressor and occupier, to other things such as the erection of checkpoints, etc. These are all the remnants of Oslo. And so while Mahmoud Abbas has said that the Oslo Accords are now dead, and they are dead, in fact, the big problem with his leadership is that he hasn't articulated an alternative vision.
If he says the Oslo Accords are dead, why is he still head of the Palestinian Authority? Doesn't that legitimize, to some extent, what the Israelis are doing?
It doesn't at all legitimize what Israel is doing. I think there's two separate issues. One is an internal democratic and democracy issue, which I'm somebody who believes that it's time for new elections. This is a president whose term expired long ago. This is a parliament whose term expired quite some time ago. This is a PLO leadership whose term expired long ago. So the issue of democracy is one issue which we internally need to address. But the issue of whether Israel can go and attack Palestinians, whether it can shoot at Palestinians, whether it can have shoot-to-kill policies, whether it can maintain an illegal siege, whether it continue to build settlements, whether it can continue to allow settlers to kill with impunity, that's something that defies international law. It's not just a question of the Oslo agreements. And therefore, Israel must be held accountable, just like every other nation is held accountable.
Do you believe there still is the possibility of a two-state solution?
I believe that the two-state solution died quite some time ago, and it died with the fact that when the Israelis continued to build their settlements, they continued to cement the mindset in Israelis that they would never leave. And then the other failure is that the international community has never imposed a price on Israel for continuing to build these settlements. And so while in theory people can talk about dismantling settlements, and indeed we saw this happen in the Gaza Strip, in practice this is something that has proven to be not only very difficult but nearly impossible. And that's why I think that what we should be moving towards is not only an issue of decolonization, removing these settlements, but a bigger issue of where is it that we're heading. I personally do not believe that the two-state solution is something that is feasible, practical, or even something that is desired. I think instead we have to start looking at rights of Palestinians whose rights extend beyond the West Bank and Gaza Strip, who extend also into what is now Israel, and start looking and changing the nature of the state to be one that is that provides equality for all, not just privileged rights for Jewish Israelis.
Now you have the US Secretary of State John Kerry. He's heading to the region. He's going to be holding separate meetings with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and then with the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas. What do you expect to come out of those talks?
I expect nothing. This is a leadership, a U.S. administration that took the decision a long time ago to have a hands-off policy when it comes to Israel's crimes, and instead continue to give money to Israel to the tune of nearly now $4 billion a year to Israel, more money than all of the other states around the world combined. Or excuse me, more than any of the countries around the world, and more than the entire continent of Africa combined. And so, you know, this is not an administration that has any view to doing anything positive. All that they aim to do is to try to manage the conflict until the next election, until they can pass the ball on to the next administration. I think that if Kerry actually wanted to do something here, they would put their money where their mouth is. They would say to the Israelis, enough is enough. You're not getting any more money from us. Unless and until you actually end and decolonize from the West Bank, unless and until you roll back the settlements. But unfortunately, I don't see that this is something that Kerry is going to do. And so he's going to rack up a few more air miles, and that's about it.
Given that that is the situation, is it time perhaps for another major player internationally to enter this? But there has been a French initiative, and the French have been calling for perhaps an international presence in some of these disputed areas.
Yes, I do think that there is time for a different player, and that player is the international community. And I also do believe that it's time to have an international protection force in the areas that Israel occupies. They're not disputed, they're occupied areas. And so, yes, I do believe that time is now for an international protection force to come in. I say this because Israel has often claimed that it intends to end its military rule. And yet, while it claims that it intends to end its military rule, it continues to build more and more settlements. And at the same time, if it's actually serious in saying that it intends to end its military rule, then it won't mind having an international protection force in place to be able to protect Palestinians in order to create a climate where it can actually end its military rule. But the problem is that Israel just pays lip service to the international community, and that's why I don't think that we'll see an international protection force. That being said, the role of the international community is not only to provide a protection force, it's now up to the international community to say that Israel is causing harm. And it's time for Israel to be held accountable. It's time for the world to boycott Israel, to divest from Israel, to impose sanctions on Israel, to hold Israel accountable, and to isolate Israel for its continued war crimes against Palestinians.